These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? How many black pieces are loose? 2. Both knights. There is no way to attack them at the same time, and no way to attack either of them while threatening the king in some way. Those loose pieces nevertheless are tantalizing targets, so white starts digging for ways to attack one of them and something else of value at the same time. The simplest way to do this is by just looking at squares from which the queen can attack either knight, and then seeing what else can be attacked from the same squares. If not a loose piece, then perhaps a piece that can be made loose. White's queen can attack the g3 knight by moving to b3 or d3. From d3 the queen also would attack the bishop on a6. That piece isn't loose, and anyway it can strike back at d3. Since white has a target, but one that doesn't work, he looks for an exchange that would improve it. He can play bishop takes bishop, provoking rook takes bishop. Now d3 has been made safe for white queen and black has a loose piece, the rook on a6. Queen moves to d3, thus attacks two loose pieces and wins the knight. You also could have found this by just examining every capture of a piece by a piece that you can initiate. Imagine 1. Bishop takes bishop, rook takes bishop, ask whether that exchange leaves behind any loose pieces, see that the rook would then be loose, look for ways to attack it along with another loose piece, find queen moves to d3. Either way, this problem resembles the earlier ones where white's queen had a clear path to a square from which it could attack the king, but needed to loosen the other target with a preliminary exchange to create a good double attack. In other words, imagine that the g3 knight in this problem is the black king, and the rest of the problem then becomes structurally the same as many we saw earlier in this chapter. The implication: if your queen can attack a loose piece and any other piece, start asking whether the other piece can be loosened, or replaced with something loose, as well. White to move. What is the best move? This position may seem elusive if you flail about at random, but it comes apart easily with methodical interrogation. Which black pieces are loose? The bishop and both rooks. You might look for ways white's queen could attack any of them and also the king, and come up empty. The needed squares e.g., d4, d7 are protected. Since there is more than one loose piece, try attacking two of them at once. Look for a square from which this could be done safely with the queen. You attack rooks from diagonals and bishops from ranks or files, so that the targets can't strike back. The h4 rook and e6 bishop could be attacked from e1, or if the king weren't protecting it from f6. The queen can't reach either square in one move, so see if it can get there in two moves, with the first one a check or other threat that controls black's response. Queen moves to c3, check. Requires the black king to move to h7 or g8, then queen moves to e1, forks the rook and bishop. Black can't escape the loss of a piece. If white instead plays the forking move, queen moves to f6, black can use the rook to protect the bishop, rook moves to e4. You also could have found this by just examining every check. The queen has checks at c3, d4, d7, and g6. Only c3 is plausible, all the others result in the queen being captured without an adequate follow-up. So you ask what would be possible after the king is forced to move. You are mindful of a. Any loose pieces, b. the king's new position on h7, and c. the white queen's new position on c3. Queen moves to e1 then is simple enough. White to move. What is the best move? White has no checks or captures to consider. There remains one other sort of forcing move that at least partially dictates the enemy response, a threat, especially by a pawn. These tend to be very effective forcing moves because your opponent generally can't afford to lose a piece for a pawn. So try pawn from e2 moves to e3. Where will the black knight go? Look at the ring of 8 light squares within its range, and see that only 2 of them are safe, b5 and f5. As usual after any sequence, you then ask what pieces would be loose, what lines would be open, and what attacks would be possible. Here the knight and bishop both would be loose, surely you saw the loose bishop from the start, and the movement of the e-pawn would have opened a line for the queen. It is urgent that white look for ways to take advantage of those 2 loose pieces in the middle of the board. If the knight moves to f5, white can use the new open line to play queen moves to g4, attacking knight and bishop at the same time. If the knight moves to b5, white can attack both pieces with queen moves to a4. The most important things about this problem are, a. not to overlook threats by pawns, they are forcing moves, and can cause big changes on the board, loose pieces and open lines, b. to remember when thinking about white's second move that the e-pawn would be out of his queen's way, and c. not to just assume the black knight will move somewhere if attacked, but instead to examine its actual options and patiently consider what you could play in response to each of them. If the position were slightly different, the fork at the end might not have worked, the knight might have been able to retreat to a safe square. But the benefits for white if the black knight does end up loose are great, so a careful study of where the piece can go is fully warranted. White to move. What is the best move? Two black pieces are loose, the rook at a8 and knight at h5. Look for a square from which the queen might attack both. The lines to them intersect at e8, way too hard to reach, and d5, more feasible. White's queen can get there in one move. The only problem is that the pawn on c6 both blocks the path to the loose rook and protects d5. We handle this with an exchange, of course, drawing the c6 pawn forward by capturing its protectorate. One knight takes at d5, pawn from c6 takes knight, and now the problem is in simpler form. You see that d5 is occupied but unguarded and the paths to both rook and knight are clear. Queen takes at d5 suggests itself as a working fork. But now pause and reflect on black's reply to queen takes at d5. One of his forked pieces, the knight on h5, is positioned aggressively. Black might be able to break out of the fork by using that knight to do some damage. Indeed, he might play knight takes bishop f4, then if white carries out the fork with queen takes rook a8, black has knight takes at e2, check. A fork of his own. So to prevent all this, white doesn't follow one. Knight takes at d5, pawn from c6 takes at d5 with queen takes at d5 right away. He first moves that vulnerable bishop off of f4, and he does it with a threat that holds the initiative. Bishop moves to c7, attacking black's queen. Notice that the bishop has protection on c7 from the rook back on c1, because black's c-pawn is gone by that time. Black thus moves his queen, and now white can go ahead with the queen fork on d5, because black can't use his knight to make a capture in reply. The piece he might have wanted to capture white's bishop is no longer there. If black is alert, of course, he will not recapture on d5 in the first place. He will let the pawn go rather than subject himself to all that has just been described. As often is the case, the value of the threatened fork is that it permits other, lesser gains by making it too costly for your opponent to recoup his losses. Here black can reply to knight takes at d5 with knight takes bishop, removing his loose knight from the coming fork. Then white has n-pawn from d5 takes knight, keeping the pawn. It all starts simply, by noticing loose pieces and asking whether you can make a double threat that includes at least one of them. If you do that, seeing the fork is reasonably easy. If you don't, it's hard. Black to move. What is the best move? Start with a routine inspection for loose white pieces, find the bishop at c1 and rook on e8, and then focus on the bishop. Black has no checks that also attack the piece, so he plays with other forcing moves. He has only one capture to consider, bishop takes bishop, to which white would respond king takes bishop. When you ponder such an exchange, think about what pieces would be left loose and what lines would be opened by it. The answer to the question about loose pieces is that the king's move to h3 would leave a loose knight on h1. The answer to the question about open lines is that taking the black bishop off the board opens a clean line for the black queen to g1. Put these points together with the loose bishop at c1 and we have an easy double attack against two loose pieces. Queen moves to g1 wins the knight. Notice how the same principles emerge time and time again. Keep track of the loose pieces on the board, but also the pieces that are left loose by any forcing sequence you can find, no matter how short. Likewise, keep track of the open lines left behind by any forcing sequence you can find, no matter how short. White to move. What is the best move? The enemy queen as a target. Usually your opponent's queen makes a poor target for a queen fork because it can defend itself by attacking the attacker. Part of the beauty of the knight fork is that a knight, on account of its unusual pattern of movement, can attack an enemy king and queen without being subject to capture by either of them. The queen as an attacker generally does not have that advantage. The exceptions are cases where, if the attacked queen does defend itself, the result is made most commonly on the back rank or else another combination. In this first example, start by examining the black king's position and the constraints on its movement. It is stuck on the back rank. White can launch an attack there with his rook on the e-file. If the black queen weren't in the way, rook moves to e8 would be made. If his queen weren't there, I could make many combinations begin with a counterfactual like this, which is why imagination plays such a large role in chess. Here the point of the insight is that black's queen is unusually vulnerable to attack because of the crucial defensive work it is doing. It also is loose, and so is black's bishop, so white looks for ways to attack them at the same time. Their lines intersect at b4, so white plays 1. Queen moves to b4. If black plays queen takes queen, then white ends the game with rook moves to e8. Black can bring his queen back to f8 to block the check, but white just takes it and mates. We aren't quite done with the analysis. After 1. Queen moves to b4, black will look for some other way to save his queen and avoid disaster. What will it be? Moving the queen to c8 where it seems to protect the bishop is no good, of course, since play then goes 1. Queen moves to b4, queen moves to c8, 2. Queen takes bishop, queen takes queen followed, again, by 3. Rook moves to e8, checkmate. Black might instead move his queen to a safe square like g8, but his best reply to queen moves to b4 probably is knight moves to c6. Do you see why? It opens a line from black's rook on a8 to his queen, so that the queen no longer is loose. Now white has a choice of 2. Queen takes bishop or 2. Queen takes queen, rook takes queen, pawn from d5 takes knight. Either way he wins a piece, but the latter sequence is a little stronger because it also takes both queens off the board, magnifying the significance of the advantage white gains. White to move. What is the best move? The principle here is similar. Black's queen is loose. As a matter of course you also study the constraints on the enemy king's movement and ask whether you have any sort of mating threat in view. Again white nearly has a mate on the bank rank. If the black queen moves forward from c7, rook takes rook is likely checkmate. In effect the queen is stuck where it is, the protection it provides the knight is illusory, so the knight is as good as loose. Look for a square from which white's queen can attack the knight and queen at the same time, taking advantage of the queen's paralysis. The search leads to queen moves to f7. If black replies queen takes queen, white plays rook takes rook, checkmate. So instead black plays queen moves to c8 or queen moves to b8, and white takes the knight. If black then plays queen takes queen, once more white can play rook takes rook, which amounts to mate after black uselessly brings his queen back. Here as in the previous problem, the queen is committed to guard duty on the back rank. Or 1. Queen moves to f7 can be met with 1. Black king moves to b8, which gives black's queen a guard. But then white has 2. Rook takes rook, queen takes rook, 3. Queen takes knight, still winning a piece. Think of our current theme this way. We have been studying double attacks. These are simultaneous attacks on two vulnerable points at the same time. A loose piece is a vulnerability, as is the king. If you attack them at the same time, you generally win one or the other. We also saw that even a mere square can be a vulnerability if the queen would deliver checkmate by landing on it. Attacking such a square and thus creating a mating threat can be as good as attacking the king itself for purposes of creating a double attack. Now we are adding still another point on the board that qualifies as a vulnerability, a queen that is defending against mate. Once you see this, once you identify a way that you could deliver mate if it weren't for the enemy queen, then attacking the queen becomes itself a kind of mating threat. The usual worry, which is that if you attack the queen it will bite back, is out of the picture. White to move. What is the best move? What black pieces are loose? All of them, rook, bishop, and queen. What sort of shape is black's king in? Not so good. Once more it is stuck in the corner behind its own pawns with no defenders on the back rank. Rook moves to d8 would be mate if it weren't for the black queen defending that square. This fact should ring a bell, the queen is preventing mate. So white looks for a way to build a double attack against the queen and something else. The natural second target is the loose rook. White can play queen moves to e5 or queen moves to e3, attacking both queen and rook. These moves look brazen, but if black plays queen takes queen, white plays rook moves to d8 and its mate, after black uselessly interposes his queen and rook, and white's rook takes each of them. So black responds to queen moves to e5 by retreating his queen to avoid mate, or, better, by moving his bishop to e6 to block the attack. White then wins the rook. The initial step in all these positions is to see if you are anywhere near threatening mate, and this includes mate threats that would exist if it weren't for the enemy queen. These can be hard to notice because mate looks so impossible. The queen prevents it, and your mind stops there. But now you will be more likely to spot such cases anyway because you realize what they mean. The queen itself can become a fine target. White to move. What is the best move? Examine the black king's position. If white safely could play rook takes rook on f8, the game would be over, but black's queen guards the rook and so prevents this. This makes the queen vulnerable to attack, as it cannot afford to leave its post to defend itself. Consider ways of going after it. If white attacks the queen with queen moves to c2, black can reply by simply moving it to d6, where it still does the same defensive work. White needs a way to threaten black's queen while also threatening something else. Black's other pieces have guards or are inaccessible, so what else can white threaten? Again, focus on black's king. White's rook not only threatens rook takes rook, it also attacks a square next to the king, g7. If white's queen were aimed at that square, it would threaten mate. So white does have a double attack. With queen moves to e5 he can attack both g7, a mating square, and black's queen, another vulnerability it can't strike back. Something has to give, and it's the black queen. Black plays rook takes rook to avoid mate, but then suffers queen takes queen and the game is over anyway. The point, of course, is that once the enemy queen becomes a good target for a fork because it can't afford to move, you can combine it with all sorts of other threats, attacks against other loose pieces, attacks against the king, or as here attacks against mating squares. To see this last option you need to be alert to multiple mate threats you can make. By assumption you already see one rook takes rook f8, that's how you realized that black's queen couldn't move. The trick is to remember there might also be a different one that then can be made the basis of a fork. You can add a threat by your queen against g7. Notice, finally, that the same effect could be achieved in a more roundabout fashion by pursuing that first idea, queen moves to c2, a little farther. We saw that black can reply with queen moves to d6, but then if white plays queen moves to d2 he attacks black's queen again. Black moves it back to c5, creating the same position seen in the diagram but with white's queen now on d2 instead of e2. White then can play queen moves to d4, again forking black's queen and the mating square g7. The reason to bother noticing this is just to remember that sometimes there may be more than one forking square and more than one way to get there. Since perfecting such a fork ends the game almost as surely as checkmate, it is worth carefully studying all the ways you might make it work. White to move. What is the best move? This position only sort of fits in this section, but it's instructive nevertheless. On a8 black has left a loose rook with an open diagonal running toward it. White has no good mating threats but his knight is in an intriguing position. It attacks e7, from which square it would check black's king. Be alert for forks anytime the knight is one move from attacking the king. Meanwhile white looks for ways to threaten the loose rook and sees that one of them is queen moves to c6, which attacks both rook and queen and requires a reply, perhaps queen takes queen. Ask how the board would look after that small sequence, and notice that black's king and queen both would be on light squares ready to be forked with knight takes bishop, which wins the bishop for white when the smoke clears. Now don't forget to ask whether black's queen, when attacked by white's queen, could both move out of harm's way and defend the other attacked piece. Suppose, for example, that instead of playing queen takes queen, black plays queen moves to b8. Now white's queen can't take black's queen or rook. But aha, the bishop at e7 would be left loose by the queen's movement, so white could play knight takes bishop with impunity. If black instead had played queen moves to d8 so as to protect both bishop and rook, white again envisions knight takes bishop. Black could answer with queen takes knight, but then the rook would be loose. Black can't have it both ways, and queen takes rook, check. Takes it? So the result is that queen moves to c6 is a working queen fork of black's queen and rook, though this time without a mate threat in the background. Instead it works because black's queen is vulnerable for a bunch of other reasons. It can move only at great cost, because it is doing other defensive work, guarding the bishop and rook, and because if it captures on c6 it lays itself open to a knight fork. White to move. What is the best move? Summary, strategic implications. Now consider some strategic implications of our study of queen forks, along with summaries of several repeating ideas. 1. Appreciating the power of checks. An important purpose of many strategic moves spent improving your position, rather than attempting to win material, is to create fertile conditions for tactical strikes on your part and poor conditions for them by your opponent. We have seen that a common form of one tactical idea, the double attack by the queen, involves a check of the enemy king coupled with an attack on a loose piece. The defensive moral for strategic purposes is clear: beware any position that allows your king to be easily checked. It is common for a beginner to imagine that open lines to his king are not a big problem so long as the king easily will be able to escape any threat that emerges, or so long as the opponent only has one piece to threaten it. Not so. The check itself is a menace, no matter how easily it can be escaped, because it requires a time-consuming response. The more ways your king can be checked, the more ways there are for you to lose other pieces to double attacks. This, and not just the fear of checkmate, is one of the reasons why it is important to castle early. It also is one of the reasons why you should not casually disturb the pawns in front of your king, since you then create open lines that make checks and mating threats, each of which may be half of a fork, easier to create. To turn the point around, one of the general goals of this chapter and the others is to change the way you think about checks. They are immensely useful weapons in the tactician's arsenal, not because they annoy your opponent or necessarily lead to mate, but because a. they require responses, thus leaving your opponent no time to address any other threats you have made at the same time, and b. they require predictable responses, and so allow you to foresee and control the action on the board. 2. Captures. Think of captures in a similar way. Don't look at a possible capture you can make, see that your opponent can then recapture, and then decide it's not worth pursuing. Rather, imagine the way the board would look after the capture and ask what you then might be able to do, what checks would be possible, what pieces would be loose, what lines would be opened, what further captures could be made, and where they would lead, all the time searching for a double threat. 3. Mating threats. We have seen many times, too, the power of mating threats. This points up the strategic value of aiming your pieces in the direction of the enemy king. Directing them this way creates not only the possibility of actual checkmate, but also a favorable climate for threats you do not expect to carry out but that allow you to make trouble elsewhere at the same time. You also can see now that exchanges or threats that open lines to the enemy king create promising conditions for tactical moves because they make mate threats easier to build. It doesn't matter that the mate threats are easily met. So long as your opponent has to spend time addressing them, they do their work, which is to buy you a free move to capture something loose elsewhere. All these points may amount to a new way of thinking about the moves you make, treating captures and attacks on the king as means to achieve other ends, not just as ends in themselves. There are smaller examples of the same point, too. A beginner decides whether to move a piece from square A to square B by asking what the piece will do on square B. The experienced player knows that the move may be more important because it vacates square A and any lines that ran through it, and blocks any lines that run through square B. Those consequences may be good or bad. The important point is to grasp them. Make yourself a student of indirect as well as direct consequences of chess moves. For loose pieces. We have seen as well the immense importance that loose pieces have for the tactician. One of the strategic implications of this can be analogized to military strategy. It is dangerous to overextend your forces, letting them wander into enemy territory with little or no protection. Those pieces can be taken for free if the enemy can make them the subject of a fork. You therefore should pause before sending a piece into your opponent's half of the board with no protection, or protection only from another one of your pieces even if you are putting it on a square not currently under attack. And from a defensive standpoint, this suggests the value of denying outpost squares well protected by enemy pawns to your opponent. If he wants to advance his pieces, make him put them where they will be loose, or where they only can be guarded by his other pieces, not by his pawns. Then maybe those guards can be exchanged or lured away, leaving the first piece loose. A pawn that protects a piece is harder to deal with. Getting rid of it by exchanging it for a piece often is too great a sacrifice to be worthwhile. 5. Defending the king. The tactical principles we have studied also shed light on the value of some basic ideas about good play, such as the aforementioned importance of castling early, and of keeping a defensive piece or two near the king. Without any defensive pieces in its vicinity, the king is left to defend its own pawn cover, which means the squares where those pawns sit are weak, which means it is easy to force the king to move by taking one of those pawns and easy for a mating threat to be set up against them. Maybe the mating threat can be thwarted easily once it arises by moving one of the pawns forward, but again that may be too late to prevent another piece from being taken if the mating threat was half of a fork. Likewise, preventing the enemy king from castling by forcing it to move early in the game can be very damaging, because after some exchanges in the center it may then become easy to throw checks at the king while also attacking other pieces. 6. Shedding light on some openings. Still another example of how tactical principles shape strategic decisions. Now you can better understand why certain openings and resulting formations are useful defensively. Think back to the many forks we saw that involved mating threats aimed at g7 or h7, or comparable squares on white's end of the board. Mating threats against those squares often suggest themselves because those squares are so weak. As just said, after castling they often are protected only by the king, so it is easy to line up a bishop and queen against them in a way that requires a move-consuming response. In the king's Indian formations, look at the position of black's king in the diagram here. Mating threats are harder to create. The h7 pawn has another pawn in front of it at g6, insulating it from attack on the diagonal. And the bishop at g7 makes it hard to set up a battery against that square. Either, unlike a pawn, the bishop can lash out against an enemy bishop or queen lining up to attack it. Naturally, these features are just one advantage of the king's Indian formations, and depending how a game goes they may not be important. The broad point is just that tactical insights often can help you understand the purposes behind an opening. 7. A style of thought. Finally, the studies in this chapter are meant to help you develop a more active and aggressive attitude at the board. Now that you see the usefulness of open lines and loose pieces, you naturally will be vigilant in searching for them and creating them, making exchanges that will leave unguarded enemy pieces in their wake or create open lines to the king, making pawn moves that open lines for your queen and other pieces and that close off lines for your opponent, coordinating your pieces to build mating threats that you may or may not be able to carry out but that might enable you to win material with a double attack. The chessboard comes alive with these sorts of thoughts once you understand how they can translate into tactical payoffs. Black to move. What is the best move? We have seen that if you want to spot and create double attacks for one of your pieces, it helps to have a clear understanding of what its natural targets are. In the case of a bishop fork, pictured to the left, as with queen forks, the most common targets are the king at one end of the double attack and a loose piece on the other. There are exceptions, of course, and we will consider them, but this is the most usual pattern and the most important to master. The reasons why this pattern is most common are by now familiar from our other work on double attacks. Consider the impediments to a fork by the bishop, the reasons why attacking two pieces with your bishop might not work. One of the forked pieces might be able to capture the bishop if the bishop's square isn't protected. One of the forked pieces might be able to break out of the double attack by making a separate threat of its own. The more valuable or less protected of the forked pieces might be able to move, leaving at the other end a piece that has protection, or moving to protect it. But all these possibilities tend to be reduced when the king is one of your targets. Your opponent is required to address the threat rather than saving the piece at the other end of the fork, nor does he have time to use the piece at the other end to make a counter threat, and because of the king's limited mobility, it usually cannot fight back itself against the forking bishop or launch a counter threat of its own. And of course a loose piece at the other end of the fork is ideal because it can be won for free. It just can't be a bishop. For the same reason a knight is an unsuitable target in a knight fork, it can bite back against its attacker. Our method of finding double attacks by the bishop, then, generally will resemble those we've developed elsewhere, searching for checks the bishop can deliver and pieces it can attack at the same time, and working to expose the king and loosen enemy pieces to create chances for those checks and attacks. The methods will be easy enough if you have read the chapter on queen forks. Whereas a queen sometimes may be able to check an enemy king in 4 or 5 different ways that need to be considered, the checks a bishop can make usually are limited to 1 and never can be more than 2, and since each bishop runs on squares of just one color, only one of your bishops can possibly give check at any given moment. Examining a bishop's checks therefore is quick and easy. Indeed, you can think of a bishop as a little like half a queen. It can make the same diagonal moves a queen can make, but not the horizontal and vertical type. Every move we will see a bishop make is a move a queen also could make. But not necessarily a move a queen would make, for the bishop has the advantage of being worth less than the queen, and thus easier to sacrifice. Giving up the bishop to win a protected rook makes sense, whereas giving a queen for the purpose does not. We can use this point to add to our list of targets for forks by the bishop, not only kings and loose pieces, but also rooks whether they are loose or not. A rook always is a good target for a bishop, because, a, it is worth more and, b, its pattern of movement makes it unable to strike back at a bishop that attacks it. Some bishop forks require not only that the forking square be available, but that the bishop be protected. Such protection generally isn't important when building knight forks because their targets, kings, queens, rooks, bishops, pawns, don't move in ways that allow them to strike back at a knight. Protecting the forking square also is unlikely to be important when creating a queen fork. If your queen can be taken, the fork probably won't be worthwhile regardless of whether you can recapture the piece that takes it. Bishop forks differ from those types because sometimes a bishop fork will include the enemy queen at one end of it. Since queens can move like bishops, a queen always can capture a bishop that attacks it unless the bishop is protected. So this is the last point about the targets for double attacks by bishops. The target can be a queen if the bishop has protection. To sum up, double attacks by the bishop generally involve some combination of these targets, listed in rough order of frequency: the king, a loose knight, any rook, and the queen if the bishop has protection. Loose pawns are fine, too, of course. Since some of the techniques for making a bishop fork work are similar to the techniques shown in the chapter on queen forks, the coverage of them here will be a bit more brief. White to move. What is the best move? There are a couple of other variables to think about as you study the bishop. The most important involve the geometries involved when the bishop inflicts a fork and the visual patterns that result from them. We didn't emphasize this as much in studying queen forks because they can occur in so many ways that have little in common visually. But double attacks by bishops require certain conditions that often have a distinctive look. A bishop fork most often occurs when your opponent has two pieces on the same diagonal with nothing between them. When the bishop moves into position, the three pieces all are in a line, the position diagrammed in skeletal form in the previous frame. It therefore is important to train your eyes to spot any two enemy pieces on the same diagonal, especially if there isn't anything between them, but even if there is. This is a good habit for other reasons as well. Pieces on the same diagonal may also be subject to a fork by your queen, or may be prey to a pin or skewer, possibilities considered elsewhere. The same goes for enemy pieces lined up on the same rank or file. They may be forked by one of your rooks, as we will see in another chapter. Sometimes they may be forked by a bishop, as we will see in a moment, and they may also be subject to a pin or skewer. Diagonals will receive a lot of attention in this chapter because that is where bishops travel, but the general point is that pieces on a line of any type are important to spot. There is another type of bishop fork that looks different and can occur when your opponent has two pieces on intersecting diagonals. When the fork is executed, the pieces are arranged not on a line but in a triangle. A fork of this kind almost always results from a capture by the bishop on the square that forms its corner of the triangle. Before the capture, the bishop was aimed at one of the pieces targeted by the fork, but an enemy piece blocked the bishop's path to the target. It might be a pawn, as in the diagram to the left where white is about to play the fork bishop takes at d6. Another way to say this is that before the bishop captures, there are three enemy pieces in a triangle, all on squares of the same color. The bishop captures one of them and forks the other two. Again, see the diagram. These patterns are important to study because to the untrained eye they don't look like the makings of a fork by a bishop. But they are poised to be forked in triangular fashion. White to move. What is the best move? The easiest and most common examples of the triangular pattern arise when two enemy pieces are on the same file or rank, often the back rank, with an odd number of squares between them. Start with the simple case of two pieces on the back rank separated by one square, the black king and rook in the stylized diagram to the left. The diagram is just meant to illustrate how some different bishop forks can work. It doesn't call for consideration of what white should actually play. Black's king and rook are arranged to be forked by a knight at e6, or by a bishop, or queen, at e7. In the bishop's case there generally will be an enemy piece already on e7 here, the pawn, otherwise the bishop would be able to take the target piece, the rook, without need of a fork. Now spread the targeted pieces 3 squares apart, the white king and c1 rook in the diagram. Again a fork is indicated by a black knight at e2, or by a bishop or queen at e3. And a bishop, or queen, fork again is possible if the targets are 5 squares apart, like the white king and a 1 rook. A queen can do the job by moving indirectly, say, from d5 to d4, imagine the white pawn on d4 rather than e3. A bishop can do it by taking an enemy piece sitting on d4, and in this latter case the enemy pieces again will be arranged as a triangle at the outset. And of course all this can happen on a vertical file as well as on a horizontal rank. The horizontal formations just are more common because the pieces start out arranged that way on the back rank and often stay there for a while. White to move. What is the best move? The types of triangles just considered are relatively easy to see once you know to look for them because they have a regular, almost equilateral appearance. But even the more oddly shaped triangles can be found by habitually looking at what the bishop already attacks, the line of enemy pieces that lie ahead of it on any of the diagonals it commands, and what else it can attack by taking one of them. See the diagram to the left, where the black and white bishops each have a fork via a pawn capture that creates an unorthodox triangle. What does all this mean for practical play? It means you will want to scan the diagonals on the board and the ranks and files, 4 pieces lined up on them. This is especially important when one of the pieces is a king. Also be alert for triangles, and relatedly for enemy pieces scattered about the board on the same color squares. A bishop can of course fork pieces only if they travel on the same color squares that it does, and almost any 2 enemy pieces on squares of the same color can, in principle, be forked by a bishop from some other square on the board, almost because there is no way to fork 2 pieces next to each other on the same diagonal. The general point nevertheless is useful, and reinforces a lesson from the chapter on knight forks. Pieces on squares of the same color tend to be most vulnerable to double attacks of various kinds. Watch for them. Now on to some examples. White to move. What is the best move? Bishop forks one move away. Look for visual patterns, observe that the king and rook are on the same diagonal with nothing between them. This cries out for a double attack by a bishop, or a queen acting like a bishop. Here, that means bishop moves to c4, check. Or you might find the answer with a routine look at forcing moves. What checks can white give with his bishops? 2. Bishop moves to e8, check. Resulting in king takes bishop, not very appealing, and bishop moves to c4, check. Bishop moves to c4, check. Also attacks the rook at a2, which white wins. Yet another way to have seen this would be to ask which black pieces are loose, which leads to the rook. The only way white can attack it is with bishop moves to c4, which also checks the king. White to move. What is the best move? What checks does white have with his bishop? Bishop moves to e4. Does the move attack anything else? Yes, it attacks and wins black's rook, which is loose. This position looks easy, and it is, but again, absorb the look of it for a minute. It is important to appreciate the use of the fianchet bishop, on the square in front of the king, to execute a fork. Later in the chapter we will see this same position again, but 2 moves earlier. White to move. What is the best move? Notice a classic triangle formation at e4/c6/e8. Or examine forcing moves and arrive at the check bishop takes at c6, check. Ask what else the move attacks and you find the loose knight on e4. So black moves his king and white wins the knight. That is the target-based way of seeing the solution. The pattern-based way would be to notice the triangular relationship between black's king, knight, and c-pawn, all on white squares. Stare at the diagram, contemplate its appearance. Incidentally, what comes next after white plays 2? Bishop takes knight. Now his bishop attacks both rooks, this time on the same diagonal, and so wins one of them as well. Again, you could see this by asking what the bishop attacks, or you could see it by scanning black's pieces for promising patterns and noticing that black's 2 rooks are on the same diagonal, just waiting to be forked if white can take the black knight with his bishop. He can best do that by advancing on the knight in a way that also gives check, i.e., with bishop takes at c6, check, thus requiring black to address the threat to his king rather than defuse the coming fork of the 2 rooks.